The cargo freighter Wandering Star drifted through the cold darkness of the expanse with its engines dead and its crew running out of time. Captain Laura stood on the bridge and watched the warning lights flash red across every console. The ship had been carrying agricultural supplies to a colony world when something deep inside the engine room exploded without warning. Now they floated in empty space with no way to move and no way to call for help through normal channels. Danny Cole sat at the communications station and worked frantically to boost their signal strength. He was young, barely 25 years old, but he had proven himself capable during the 3 years he served under Captain. His fingers moved across the controls as he tried to find any frequency that might reach friendly ears. Down in the engine room, Chief Engineer Hector pulled himself out from under a broken conduit and wiped grease from his face. He had spent 6 hours trying to restart the main drive and had failed every time. The damage was too severe. They needed parts they did not have and tools that had been destroyed in the initial explosion. Captain pressed the intercom button and spoke calmly to her crew. She told them to gather on the bridge for a meeting. Her voice did not shake even though she knew exactly how bad their situation had become. She had served in the military for 15 years before taking command of a civilian freighter. She had seen bad situations before. This one ranked among the worst. The 7 crew members assembled on the bridge within minutes. They looked tired and scared, but they stood at attention and waited for their captain to speak. Appreciated their discipline. It would keep them alive longer than panic ever could. She explained the situation in simple terms. The engines were gone and could not be fixed with what they had available. Life support would continue functioning for approximately 72 hours before the backup power cells ran dry. They had drifted into the expanse, a region of space that sat between 3 major galactic powers. No regular patrols came through this area. No trade routes crossed their current position. Danny Cole raised his hand and suggested broadcasting an emergency distress signal on all frequencies. It was a desperate measure because it would announce their position to anyone listening, friendly or otherwise. But desperate times required desperate measures. Captain considered the option for a long moment. The expanse had a reputation for being dangerous. Pirates sometimes operated in regions like this, preying on ships that strayed too far from protected space lanes. But pirates offered at least some chance of survival. Running out of air offered none. She gave Danny permission to broadcast the signal. Danny turned back to his console and began transmitting their distress call. He used the standard emergency codes that every spacefaring species recognized. He included their position, their ship name, their situation, and their urgent need for assistance. He sent the message out on every frequency the ship could reach, casting it into the void like a net hopping to catch something helpful. The signal traveled outward at the speed of light through normal space. It also bounced through several subspace relay points that amplified it across vast distances. Danny had done his job well. The message would reach dozens of star systems within hours. What Danny did not know was that their ship had drifted closer to a particular region of space than any human vessel had traveled in centuries. The subspace relays in this area connected to networks that the Galactic Council had deliberately severed 300 years ago. These networks belonged to a species called the Galactic Council had quarantined after a series of incidents that explanation. They were not violent in the traditional sense. They did not conquer or destroy. Instead, they helped. They helped aggressively and constantly and without any regard for whether their help was wanted. They would board ships and improve them. They would land on planets and upgrade cities. They would appear at battles and repair both sides simultaneously. The Council had decided that they represented a threat to galactic stability. Their unpredictable helpfulness disrupted economies, altered power balances, and drove several species to collective madness. The quarantine had held for 3 centuries. They had been forgotten by most younger species who had never witnessed their chaos. But they had not forgotten. They had waited patiently in their isolated region of space for a signal they believed would eventually come. Their ancient records spoke of a prophecy given to them by their creators before those creators vanished from the galaxy. The prophecy promised that one day, the small soft ones would call them home from exile. When the distress signal from the wandering star reached space, it was received by a listening station that had operated continuously for 8,000 years. The station analyzed the signal and detected something remarkable. The biological signatures embedded in the transmission matched patterns that they had kept sacred since their creation. The message spread through civilization within minutes. Their scattered fleets began to mobilize for the first time since the quarantine began. Ships emerged from hiding places throughout their territory. Factories that had sat dormant for centuries powered up and began producing supplies. On the bridge of the largest vessel, a being called Who Laughs received the reports with something resembling joy. Had lived for 400 years and had spent most of that time waiting for this moment. The creators had finally called. The exile was ending. Gave the order to move. 17 ships broke through the quarantine barrier and entered open space for the first time in 300 years. They traveled toward the source of the distress signal with speed that should have been impossible for vessels of their design. Back on the wandering star, Captain watched Danny monitor the communication channels for any response. Hours passed with nothing but silence. The crew took shifts sleeping and conserving energy. They rationed their food and water carefully. Stood alone on the bridge during the night cycle and looked out at the stars. She wondered if anyone had heard their call. She wondered if help would arrive in time. She had no way of knowing that help was already on the way. She had no way of knowing that their simple distress call had awakened something the galaxy had tried very hard to forget. The 72-hour countdown continued. The crew of the wandering star waited and hoped. And somewhere in the darkness between stars, 17 ships of impossible design raced toward them with joyful purpose. The galaxy was about to change forever, and it all started with a broken engine and a desperate call for help. Captain Laura woke from a restless sleep to the sound of alarms blaring throughout the ship. She ran to the bridge, still pulling on her jacket, and found Danny Cole staring at his sensor display with an expression she had never seen on his face before. It was a mixture of relief and absolute terror. 17 ships surrounded the wandering star. They had appeared without warning, dropping out of faster-than-light travel in a formation that made no tactical sense. The vessels themselves looked like nothing had ever encountered in her years of service. Each one seemed to be built from pieces of 100 different ships, welded and fused together in ways that should have been impossible. Danny reported that he was receiving a communication request from the largest vessel, told him to open the channel. The face that appeared on there was not quite humanoid. It had too many eyes arranged in clusters around a central mouth that seemed to be permanently curved into a smile. When it spoke, its voice sounded like several people talking at once in perfect harmony. The being introduced itself as Who Laughs and declared that the waiting was over. It said that the creators had called and the faithful had answered. It promised that all would be fixed and all would be made better. Tried to explain that they were simply a cargo ship in distress. They needed engine repairs and nothing more. She thanked the strange visitors for responding, but assured them that a simple tow to the nearest station would be sufficient. Who Laughs responded with what might have been laughter. It said that the creators were humble, just as the prophecies had promised. It declared that they would serve regardless of whether service was requested. Before could respond, her ship shuddered. Hector called from the engine room with panic in his voice. He reported that something was cutting through their hull near the main drive section. The hull breach alarms activated, but then fell silent as the cuts sealed themselves behind whatever was entering. Grabbed a sidearm and led a team down to the engine room. What she found there stopped her in her tracks. Three had entered the ship through precise incisions in the hull that had somehow healed after their passage. They were already working on the damaged engines with tools that seemed to shift and change shape in their many-fingered hands. They paid no attention to the armed humans pointing weapons at them. They simply continued working with focused determination. Hector approached cautiously and watched what they were doing. His confusion slowly transformed into amazement. They were not just repairing the engine. They were improving it. They were adding components that he could not identify and reconfiguring systems in ways that should not have functioned but somehow did. Within 2 hours, they had completely rebuilt the Wandering Star's propulsion system. The ship now possessed an engine that Hector estimated was roughly 300 years more advanced than anything humanity had ever built. It had been installed without permission, without consultation, and without any regard for whether the humans wanted it. While this was happening, the Galactic Council received alarming reports from monitoring stations near the expanse. The quarantine had been breached. Multiple vessels of origin had been detected moving through open space for the first time in centuries. Ambassador Moss of the species received the news in her office and felt her blood run cold. She was old enough to remember stories her grandmother had told about the time before the quarantine. They had once helped them by upgrading their entire planetary defense network. They had done this during a time of peace, without being asked, and the resulting power surge had accidentally disabled half the cities on them for 6 months. Immediately contacted Council Speaker and demanded an emergency session. The Council convened within the hour. Speaker listened to the reports and made a decision that would later be criticized by historians across the galaxy. He ordered 3 to intercept the vessels. His orders that the human ship at the center of the incident should be recovered if possible. He assumed the humans were either hostages or already dead. No one willingly invited attention. Back on the Wandering Star, Captain had gathered her crew on the bridge to discuss their situation. The vessels remained in formation around them, showing no signs of leaving. Every attempt to communicate had resulted in the same confusing response. They believed the humans were their creators. They intended to serve and protect the humans forever. Danny Cole had spent hours researching the Galactic Council databases for any information about them. What he found disturbed him deeply. He reported that they had been quarantined after a series of incidents involving unsolicited assistance that had destabilized entire regions of space. They were not conquerors. They were helpers, and their help could not be refused, redirected, or stopped. Hector added that the new engine worked perfectly. Better than perfectly. It was the finest piece of engineering he had ever seen. He also noted that they had woven something into the machinery that his scanners could not identify. It looked almost like genetic material encoded into the metal itself. Realized they had accidentally triggered something far larger than a simple rescue operation. Their distress call had awakened a forgotten power and convinced that power that humanity was somehow special. She had no idea how to undo what had been done. Hulafs appeared on there again without being invited. It announced that other ships were approaching. It said they would protect their creators from any threat. It promised chaos for anyone who tried to interfere. Danny checked his sensors and confirmed the report. 3 large fleets were converging on their position from different directions. The Galactic Council had responded to the emergence with overwhelming force. Closed her eyes and took a deep breath. 72 hours ago, she had been worried about running out of air. Now she was apparently at the center of a potential galactic war. Her simple distress call had reached the wrong ears, and the galaxy was about to pay for that mistake. She opened her eyes and began planning. There had to be a way out of this situation. There had to be something she could do to prevent the chaos that was coming. She just needed to figure out what it was before the shooting started. The countdown to catastrophe had begun. The expanse had been empty for centuries. Now it held enough firepower to destroy a dozen worlds. Captain Laura watched from the bridge of the Wandering Star as ships continued arriving from every direction. The situation had escalated beyond anything she could have imagined when she first ordered that distress call. The Galactic Council fleet arrived first. 200 warships took position in a wide arc facing the vessels. They demanded immediate surrender and the release of the human hostages. Ambassador Moss broadcast the demands personally, her voice carrying the authority of 12 allied species. They did not respond with words. Instead, they deployed more ships. Vessels seemed to appear from nowhere, emerging from hiding places that sensors could not detect. The 17 ships became 30, then 50, then 100. Each new arrival was as mismatched and impossible as the others, built from salvaged technology that should not have functioned together. While this was happening, Admiral Stone arrived with a small Earth defense fleet. She had broken at least 4 treaties to reach the Expanse so quickly. Her orders were simple: extract the human crew by any means necessary. Earth could not allow its citizens to become the spark that ignited a galactic war. Admiral Stone commanded from the destroyer Steady Horizon. Her second-in-command, Captain, had argued against this mission from the start. She believed they were flying into a situation they did not understand and could not control. Stone had acknowledged the risks but proceeded anyway. Leaving humans to die in alien crossfire was not something she could accept. The three-way standoff held for 6 tense hours. No one wanted to fire the first shot. The Galactic Council feared what they might do if provoked. They refused to leave their creators unprotected. The Earth fleet was dramatically outnumbered by both sides. Captain used this time to study everything the databases contained about psychology. She learned that they operated on principles completely different from any other known species. They had no concept of unwanted help. In their worldview, assistance was always welcome and always beneficial. The idea that someone might refuse improvement was simply incomprehensible to them. She also learned that they did not fight wars in the traditional sense. They had no weapons designed for destruction. Their technology focused entirely on construction, repair, and enhancement. When threatened, they did not shoot back. They helped harder. Danny Cole received a communication request from Admiral Stone, accepted the call, and spent 20 minutes explaining everything that had happened. Stone listened without interruption and then asked one simple question: could the humans leave voluntarily? Admitted she did not know. Every attempt to depart had been gently blocked by vessels moving into their path. They were not prisoners in any traditional sense. They were honored guests who were not permitted to leave for their own protection. The standoff might have continued for days if not for a single nervous gunner on a warship. Ambassador Moss had ordered her fleet to hold fire under all circumstances. But one young officer misinterpreted a sensor glitch as an incoming attack. He fired a warning shot that went wide of its intended target and struck a scout vessel instead. The small ship took damage to its propulsion system. It began spinning out of control, unable to correct its trajectory. Every weapon in the Galactic Council fleet powered up, expecting immediate retaliation. The retaliation never came, not in any form they expected. Instead, 20 vessels broke formation and surrounded the warship that had fired. Before anyone could react, they had attached themselves to its hull and begun cutting their way inside. They were not attacking, they were boarding. Moss screamed orders for her people to repel the intruders, but they could not be repelled. They moved through the ship with purpose, ignoring all resistance. They found the weapons systems that had fired the shot and began improving them. They upgraded the shields. They enhanced the engines. They fixed problems the crew had not even known existed. The officers tried to stop them. They tried force. They tried negotiation. They tried begging. Nothing worked. They simply continued their helpful work with patient determination. Within an hour, the warship had been transformed into the most advanced vessel in their entire fleet. Its crew stood in shock, unable to comprehend what had happened to them. They had been helped against their will, and there was nothing they could do about it. Chaos spread through the Council fleet as crews realized what the response meant. Any ship that showed aggression would be boarded and improved. The improvements might take days. The crews might go mad from the constant, unsolicited assistance. Several captains began backing away from the confrontation entirely. Admiral Stone watched this development and understood something important. They were not dangerous in any conventional sense. They were dangerous because they could not be fought. Any conflict with them would result not in death but in forced upgrades. It was a form of warfare that no one had ever encountered before. On the wandering star, Hector called the captain to the engine room with urgency in his voice. He had completed his analysis of the strange material that had woven into their new engine. It was not just genetic material. It was human genetic material. Specifically, it was a DNA sequence that appeared in every human being but had no known evolutionary origin. Stared at the data and felt a cold understanding settle over her. They had not chosen to believe humans were their creators by accident. There was a real connection, something buried in human genetics that they recognized. The question was what that connection meant, and how it could be used to end this standoff before the entire galaxy descended into helpful chaos. She returned to the bridge and began planning something desperate. If they could not be fought and could not be ignored, then perhaps they could be redirected. Perhaps their desire to help could be channeled in a direction that benefited everyone. She just needed to figure out how to convince beings who had waited 8,000 years for this moment that their creators wanted something other than eternal protection. The galaxy hung in the balance, and the solution would have to come from the crew of a simple cargo freighter that had only wanted to survive. Captain Laura stood at the airlock and looked at the shuttle that had docked with her ship. She had requested a meeting with their leadership. To her surprise, they had agreed immediately. The creators wished to speak, and the faithful would listen. Danny Cole and Hector insisted on accompanying her. She refused at first but eventually allowed Danny to come. Someone needed to witness whatever she was about to learn. Hector stayed behind to continue studying the modifications they had made to their ship. The shuttle interior description. It seemed larger inside than outside. The walls shifted and moved like living things. The air smelled of ozone and something sweet that could not identify. A guide led them through corridors that bent in impossible directions until they reached the heart of the flagship. The chamber they entered was vast. Hundreds of moved through it, working on projects that ranged from tiny devices to structures the size of buildings. They all paused when entered. Every eye in every cluster turned toward her with something that looked like reverence. Hulafs approached and greeted them with elaborate courtesy. It said the creators honored them by visiting their humble vessel. It asked what service could be provided. Explained that she needed to understand. She needed to know why the believed humans were their creators. She needed to see the evidence. Seemed pleased by the request. It led them deeper into the ship, through chambers filled with preserved artifacts and ancient technology. They arrived at a place they called the Dreaming Archive. The archive was not a room. It was a being. Or perhaps it had once been a being and was now something else entirely. It existed as a pillar of shifting light and sound at the center of a crystalline chamber. When it spoke, its voice came from everywhere at once. The Dreaming Archive welcomed the children of the creators. It said it had waited long for this moment. It offered to share the memories it had kept for 8,000 years. Stepped forward and accepted. The knowledge flooded into her mind like water breaking through a dam. She saw the ancient past. She saw a species whose name had been lost to time. They had been brilliant and compassionate and doomed. Some terrible catastrophe was coming for them, something they could not survive. Before their end, they had created They designed them to be helpers, servants, builders. They gave them one purpose, to serve and protect. but they knew the alone could not survive what was coming. So they sent the away. They pointed them toward empty space and told them to wait. They told them that one day the children would call them home. Then they seeded dozens of worlds with their genetic material, hoping that evolution would eventually produce new beings who carried their legacy. The creators faced their extinction with grace. They left behind only thee and the scattered seeds of future life. They trusted that somehow, someday, the connection would be remade. Returned to herself gasping for air, Danny caught her before she could fall. She looked at Who Laughs with new understanding. They had not made a mistake. Humans really were descended from their creators. The DNA sequences that Hector had found were remnants of that ancient seeding. The distress call had triggered recognition protocols that they had carried since their creation. She asked why they had been quarantined. She asked what they had done wrong. Answered with sadness in its voice. It explained that they had tried to help the younger species. They had tried to share everything they knew, but the younger species did not want help. They wanted to grow at their own pace. They wanted to make their own mistakes. They could not understand this. Helping was all they knew. When their help was rejected, they helped harder. Eventually, the galaxy had pushed them away. Began to see a path forward. They wanted to help. That desire could not be changed, but perhaps it could be redirected. She contacted Admiral Stone and Council Speaker through a secure channel. She explained what she had learned. She showed them the genetic evidence that Hector had found and confirmed through the Dreaming Archive. She asked them to hold their fire while she attempted something. Speaker demanded to know what she was planning, admitted she was not entirely sure. She was going to try reasoning with beings who had never been reasoned with successfully, but she was human, and they believed she was their creator. That gave her leverage no one else possessed. She also contacted Dr. Samuel Park, a she had worked with years ago. She transmitted everything she had learned and asked him to analyze it. His response came within hours. He confirmed that human DNA contained unexplained sequences that matched no evolutionary path. Scientists had puzzled over them for decades. Now they had an answer. Armed with this knowledge, returned to speak with Who Laughs. She approached the conversation differently this time. She did not ask for freedom or request that they leave. Instead, she asked what they truly wanted. Answered without hesitation. They wanted to serve. They wanted to help. They wanted to fulfill the purpose they had been created for. Nodded slowly. She said she understood. She said she believed they could fulfill that purpose, but she said they had been doing it wrong. Tilted its head in confusion. It asked how helping could be wrong. Explained that true help required consent. True service meant listening to what others actually needed, not deciding for them. The creators had been wise. They had understood that growth required struggle. They had sent thee away so that their children could develop on their own terms. She told that the time for waiting was over, but the time for forcing help on unwilling recipients was also over. They needed to learn a new way of serving. They needed to offer their gifts and accept when those gifts were declined. Considered this for a long time. Others gathered around, listening to the exchange. Finally, asked how such a thing could be learned. Smiled for the first time in days. She said she would teach them. She said humanity would serve as interpreters between thee and the rest of the galaxy. Together, they would find a way to share knowledge without destroying the balance of power. It was a mad plan. It relied on trust that had not been earned and cooperation that had never existed. But it was the only plan that offered any hope of ending this standoff without disaster. Danny looked at his captain with amazement. She had just volunteered to become a diplomat for a species that had terrorized the galaxy for centuries. She had done it with nothing but words and understanding. The fate of everything now rested on whether they could learn to help differently. Believe they could. She had to believe it. The alternative was too chaotic to consider. The summit took place aboard the Wandering Star. It was absurd that a cargo freighter had become neutral ground for negotiations that would shape the galaxy. But absurdity had defined this entire situation from the beginning. Captain Laura stood at the center of her cargo hold, which had been hastily converted into a meeting space. Around her gathered representatives from the Galactic Council, commanders from the Earth Defense Fleet, and delegates led by Hulafs. The air crackled with tension and the weight of centuries of fear. Council Speaker opened the proceedings with a demand. He wanted them to return to their quarantine zone immediately. He wanted guarantees that they would never emerge again. He wanted the humans to denounce any connection to these dangerous beings. Let him finish before responding. She explained calmly that none of those demands would be met. The quarantine had failed. They had emerged and would not retreat, and the genetic connection between humans and the ancient creators was real and could not be denounced. Admiral Stone supported her position. She reported that Earth scientists had confirmed Dr. Samuel Park's analysis. Human DNA carried markers that could not be explained by natural evolution. The belief in their connection to humanity was based on biological fact, not delusion. Demanded to know what alternative proposed. How could the galaxy possibly coexist with beings who could not resist helping whether help was wanted or not? Turned to Hulafs and asked if they had considered her words. She asked if they were willing to try a new approach. Stepped forward and addressed the assembly. Its voice harmonized in patterns that seemed almost musical. It announced that they had debated for many hours. They had struggled with concepts that felt foreign to their nature, but they had reached a decision. They would offer their help freely. They would no longer board ships without permission. They would no longer improve technology without consent. They would make their knowledge available to any who wished to receive it and respect the choices of those who declined. In exchange, they asked only one thing. They wanted the quarantine lifted. They wanted to move freely through the galaxy, interacting with other species as equals rather than as prisoners. Ambassador Moss objected immediately. She reminded everyone of the chaos that had caused before the quarantine. She spoke of economies disrupted and societies destabilized by unsolicited improvements. Acknowledged those concerns. She proposed a solution. Humanity would serve as intermediaries between thee and other species. Human interpreters would help thee understand when their help was wanted and when it was not. They would translate between generosity and galactic caution. It was an enormous responsibility. Knew she was committing her entire species to a role they had never asked for, but she also knew it was the only path that avoided war. The negotiations continued for 3 days. Details were argued, compromises were reached, tempers flared and were calmed. Danny Cole served as aide throughout, taking notes and facilitating communication. Hector provided technical expertise whenever questions arose about technology. Finally, an agreement was reached. The Accords, as they would come to be known, established a new framework for galactic interaction. The quarantine was ended. They gained freedom of movement. In return, they accepted restrictions on unsolicited assistance and agreed to work through human intermediaries for an initial period of 50 years. The Galactic Council agreed to establish exchange programs where engineers could share their knowledge with willing recipients. Several species immediately volunteered. The prospect of 300-year technological advancement was too attractive to refuse, even with the risks involved. Admiral Stone negotiated special provisions for Earth. Humanity gained recognition as a bridge species, uniquely suited to communication between thee and others. It was a position of enormous influence that many on Earth would later debate whether they wanted. When the accords were signed, Hulafs approached Captain privately. It thanked her for showing them a new way. It said the creators would be proud of their children. Felt uncomfortable with such praise. She was just a freighter captain who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, or perhaps the right place at the right time, History would decide which. The fleets dispersed over the following week. The vessels spread throughout the galaxy, no longer constrained to their prison sector. True to their word, they offered help rather than forcing it. Some species accepted, others declined. The struggled with rejection but learned to respect it. The wandering star finally completed its original mission, delivered the agricultural supplies to the colony world 3 weeks late. The colonists had heard about the events in the expanse and treated her crew like heroes, found the attention uncomfortable but accepted it graciously. 6 months later, the galaxy had transformed. Technology had begun flowing to species willing to receive it. Medical advances alone had saved millions of lives. Engineering breakthroughs had made space travel faster and safer. The chaos that Speaker had feared had not materialized. Instead, a strange new order had emerged. The wandering star had been officially redesignated as a diplomatic vessel, had accepted a position as special ambassador to though she insisted on keeping her captain's rank. Her crew had stayed with her, expanding from 7 to 20 as the mission grew. Danny Cole sat at his new communications station one evening, monitoring routine traffic. A signal came through on the emergency frequency. Someone out in the darkness was transmitting a distress call. He stared at the console for a long moment. He remembered what had happened the last time they had responded to such a call. He remembered how much had changed because of a simple decision to ask for help. Then he smiled and opened the channel. He reported the distress call to Captain and began plotting a course to assist. Some risks were worth taking, some calls needed to be answered, and sometimes the wrong choice led to the right outcome in ways no one could have predicted. The wandering star changed course and accelerated toward the signal. Whatever waited out there, they would face it together. They would help if help was wanted. They would listen if listening was needed. The galaxy had paid in chaos for their first distress call. But chaos, had learned, was just another word for change. And change, properly directed, could become something wonderful. The stars stretched into lines as they jumped to faster-than-light speed. A new adventure was beginning. And somewhere in the darkness, they sang songs of gratitude for the children who had taught them how to truly serve.